Hey guys. Okay. So we're going to finish out chapter 2 today. Since we couldn't have class, and I'm gonna pick up pretty much right where we left off in class, with the psychological dimensions of puberty. You should see the slides hopefully on your screen, as well as see me. Um, and I have some statistics for you guys that I'm going to kind of talk about while we go through this, something we would have done in class anyway, but just to kind of give you guys an idea of what we're going to be going over. We're going to finish out chapter 2 talking about some of the basics of biology and hormones, DNA, and we're going to start with this psychological dimensions of puberty. So we talked a bit about body art in class, and so we're going to move on to hormones and behavior. And so when we look at some of the hormonal changes that occur during adolescence. Now, one thing that we have to kind of remark on is, this is a pretty significant change in terms of what's going on in the body during this adolescent period. And so when we look at some of those hormonal factors, now we know that the hormone changes that are going on during adolescence, during puberty, do in fact affect some of these negative emotions. And so we see that increase in negative emotion. It's pretty characterized in adolescent development, that many of us can probably remember, as well as if you've been anywhere near an adolescent, you can be familiar with this sort of negative emotional atmosphere. We know that androgen in boys, higher levels have been associated with violence as well as acting out. And in girls, there seems to be a relationship between estrogen levels, increased estrogen levels, and depression in girls. And so again, these are some hormonal factors that we know are involved. We know that the hormone factors alone aren't responsible for risk-taking behavior and depression, but we do know that this hormonal activity does influence some of those factors. However, hormones themselves can be influenced by things like environmental factors, adolescent relationships, stress, eating, activity, and depression, and all of these. So depression can not only be affected by, but can affect hormones, So depression can affect hormones and can be affected by hormones. So it's a very cyclical sort of relationship there. When we talk about early and late maturation, there seems to be a little bit of a gender difference here. So in boys who mature a little earlier, they tend to see themselves a little bit more positively than late maturing boys. And then for early maturing girls, we see similar effects, but they're just not as strong. So we find that researchers have really discovered that early maturing girls are actually much more vulnerable to a number of problems compared to later maturing girls. So again, some of these timing of onset of puberty and speed at which one goes through puberty can have effects that affect emerging adulthood all the way through adulthood, as well as increasing vulnerability. And so this sort of begs the question, do we tend to exaggerate this, pubertal changes in behavior? And so I think that we know that there's been a lot of study in adolescence, not as much as there should be. We're still quite behind in figuring all of this out. But I think that it can be said that there's a lot of individual differences here. We can't just single out one or two biological changes and say that that's the dominant influence. We have to look at everything together. And I think that what we find throughout all of this is that, cognitive factors, social factors, environmental factors all impact how we go through puberty. And I think that those are the factors that we need to focus on, and also realize that I think that in some cases, certain aspects are exaggerated, but we do need to think about the big picture and the whole picture. So moving on to sort of health aspect of all of this. And we're going to go into more detail on some of this stuff a little bit later. So what we end up doing is we kind of come back to a lot of these concepts throughout the class. And so when we look at adolescent health behavior, some of it's pretty alarming. So a lot of the behaviors linked to poor health habits and early death in adulthood really begin during adolescence. And this is where it can get really problematic. And I think this is a big factor in terms of trying to figure out some really good interventions, because adolescents reach this period of time where they're the strongest, they're the quickest, they have the most energy than they've ever had their entire life, and really honestly will ever have in their entire life. And so there's a sense of you can't touch me. And this invulnerability that kind of, it makes adolescents think that they're invincible. And so when an adolescent gets sick or when they get hurt, they tend to recover very, very quickly. And they really tend to never suffer from poor health. And this is the majority. This isn't, individuals that are sort of outliers that have significant health conditions, things like that. We're talking sort of the general adolescent tend to not really get sick. And if they do get sick, they recover and it's fine. So the issue is that when we're talking about risky behaviors like sexual intercourse, unprotected sex, drugs, wearing seatbelts, getting adequate sleep, going to the doctor, listening to your body, figuring out what things might be wrong, being active, eating really well. A lot of these behaviors really need to be solidified in adolescence, because then what happens is if they're not, then the adolescent's already in a bad habit and it becomes much more difficult to change those behaviors as adolescent ages. And so when we look at some of these sort of health compromising behaviors, this increase of risk taking, we see that in adolescence. And so we need to do things like, so here it says community resources, getting adolescents, getting them involved in sports in their community, getting them involved in, like Boys and Girls Club and volunteering and making secure attachments. All of these are, very, very important. When we look at the brain changes, and we're going to talk about this in chapter 3, when we look at these changes in neurobiological factors, what we're seeing is that the adolescent brain is going through some really, really important changes. And so when you have these important changes during this period of time where adolescents are engaging in more risk-taking behavior, they're seeking out thrills, and they want to experience and feel more. And so, we'll talk about this a lot later, this idea that using drugs, for example, can actually have a much bigger impact on a person if they use them during adolescence, during this period of critical brain development. We will actually see differences in how that person is able to cope with addiction compared to an adult becoming addicted, not during adolescence. So we'll talk much more about that, but these neurobiological changes are really important and ones that we need to not overlook. And so also there's this idea that maybe we can, go ahead and have these adolescents experience this risk taking in a health and safe way. And how can we do that isn't going to compromise their health? And how can we do that so that they're safe and they're not likely to die or get hurt? And so that's a major question. There are some cultures, for example, where they kind of allow adolescents to have a bit of a crazy period. And is that okay? And is that safe? And I think that, being able to increase social capital of a community, for example, expanding networks, expanding relationships, getting adolescents involved in their community, and also allowing parents and community members, teachers, mentors to monitor adolescent behavior and realize that there's more to an adolescent's life than just peers and parents, that there's a lot of other potential avenues for monitoring that can take place that isn't just parents. And so there's a lot of question there of can we do that, and is that possible? So looking at some of the health services that adolescents do and don't take advantage of, when it comes down to it, adolescents really do not use the health system, the healthcare providers very well. They don't believe that people understand them. They don't really think that that they can help, that doctors can help them. A lot of healthcare providers do want to provide better care for adolescents, but simply lack the training of this very specific developmental period. Adolescent males, especially older adolescent males, are notorious for using health services less than any of the adolescents out there. And so, of course, adolescents tend to not use these health services because of cost, poor availability. They just don't know what's out there. Lack of confidentiality. They're too afraid to tell their doctor anything, or they have to have their parent with them, and they're not going to open up with their parent there. And they're just reluctant to talk about sensitive issues, and they don't really want to talk about their sex life or lack of sex life to their doctor. And so I think that that kind of adds into the mix of not wanting to take advantage of these services. When we look at the leading causes of death in adolescence, of course, accidents, which are like unintentional accidents. I'm just going to tell you guys some statistics here. So almost half of all deaths from 15 to 24-year-old adolescent or young adults are due to unintentional injuries, and 3/4 of them involve motor vehicles. About 50% of the motor vehicle fatalities involving adolescents, the driver actually has had a blood alcohol level of 0.10%, which is twice the designated under the influence limit in most states. So of course, drinking, driving, motor vehicle accidents, all of these are large contributors to adolescent death. Homicide, especially in African-American males, are actually 3 times more likely to be killed by guns than natural causes. Suicide has been a major issue from the 1950s to today, has about tripled in the rate. Although very recent years, we find that there have been declines in suicide rates, but again, it has gotten pretty significant since 1950. And this is pretty considerate looking at emerging adulthood. We're seeing that compared to adolescents, emerging adults engage in more health compromising behaviors. They have more health problems, more chronic health problems, and they're more likely to be obese and have a mental health disorder. And so, here's one major cause for concern. So you see this more than twice the mortality rate of adolescents, emerging adults have more than twice the mortality rate of adolescents. The problem is that we see all of these adolescents thinking that they're invincible and invulnerable and not having any sort of health problems. But then when we look at the habits, they're really, really terrible habits, and these habits will continue on and through emerging adulthood. And so we're seeing that these emerging adults are really, they're reaping the problems that were caused by their activities while they're adolescents. And so, and we're seeing this more and more. And I think each one of us can think about how poorly we ate and how less we didn't exercise a lot, maybe as adolescents. And then what ends up happening is even harder to correct that behavior. And then so these individuals are experiencing significant health problems through emerging adulthood. And here you can see, this is just some statistics on males and females, ages 12 to 17 and 18 to 24. So we have an adolescent period here, and then what we refer to sort of emerging adulthood. And you can see there that there's some pretty significant rates in terms of different types of causes of death from adolescence through to emerging adulthood. So that's definitely cause for concern. When we look at nutrition and exercise, for example, many adolescents today live off of fast food. in Wise, it's a little bit different because we don't have as many choices. But when you look at bigger cities, you know, there is a McDonald's and, you know, a Chipotle and a Moe's and Wendy's and whatever on every corner, it feels like. And so, you know, especially in bigger cities where adolescents have a lot more options, you see them going after these different fast food restaurants, and some of them even being in the schools, and some of them being accessible to them in terms of on a daily basis. And so that can be really problematic if they're eating breakfast, lunch, and dinner, you know, in a fast food restaurant. And so when you look at the number of adolescents who have eating disorders, for example, they're increasing. You see that in some of the studies looking at regular family meals, we see actually that eating regular family meals during early adolescence actually is linked to healthy eating behaviors as much as 5 years later. So we're seeing that, you know, this promoting good behavior in terms of good nutrition behavior is very important for an adolescent as they continue through this developmental stage. We know that, of course, parents play an important role in not only their food choices, but also in eating behavior. And so, of course, you know, schools are playing an important role because, you know, we have to have healthy options, not high fat level options, not a bunch of machines where kids can go in and, you know, eat chips for lunch. If they have really good options with low fat meals, that can contribute to a healthy adolescent. One issue that we see a lot of times in adolescence is energy drinks and consumption of calories just through not food, but sodas and other kinds of drinks that are really other than water. Even Gatorade has a really high sugar content and can be problematic if the adolescent isn't active. And so this kind of leads to this idea that exercise is also lacking. We see that in a recent study, it's a national study of US 9 to 15-year-olds, we find that almost all 9 and 11-year-olds met the federal government's moderate to vigorous exercise recommendations per day. Okay, so that's a minimum of 1 hour, 60 minutes per day. 31% of 15-year-olds met the recommendations during the weekdays, and only 17% met it on the weekend. So we're seeing that adolescents are not being active. The good chunk of adolescents aren't even meeting the requirements that the government says that, you know, these particular age groups should be exercising. We also see some ethnic differences in terms of exercise participation, as well as gender differences. So there was a study that was done in 28 countries, and they found that that U.S. adolescents exercised less and ate more junk food than adolescents in almost all the other countries. And that U.S. adolescents were much more likely to eat fried foods, less likely to eat fruits and vegetables compared to any other adolescent in any other country that was studied. And so we know this is a major problem. You know, when we look at what exercise does to a person's quality of life, it improves their quality of life. They feel better. They are able to, they're happier. When we look at what it does to the body, of course, it has a good effect, positive effect on weight, on blood pressure, on the risk of diabetes. We see that people adolescents who do exercise frequently actually do have less risk-taking behavior. For example, lower level of alcohol use, cigarette and marijuana use. We see a better connectivity in brain and cognitive skills when an individual is exercising. Improved sleep and activity go very, very closely hand in hand. And then, of course, sleep and activity is related to your emotion and mood level, how well you're able to control your emotion, as well as concentration, focusing, and memory capacity. And also we see that there have been some studies using exercise as an intervention in ADHD, and find that it does reduces symptoms of ADD, especially when it comes to attention in some of these conditions. And so just kind of looking at here, you can see that there are some gender and ethnicity differences in terms of exercise rates. So I'll give you some time to look at that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to stop this video, and I'm going to go ahead and resume on through the slideshow, just kind of break it up just a little bit so that it's not all at once. But the idea is for you to play one, maybe take a break, and then come back and play another one. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the video, and then I'm going to go ahead and start a new one, and this will resume into the other factors that impact adolescent exercise.